Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Nick. I'm from Red Hat, as mentioned. I'm here to talk to you about Ansible, specifically some best practices. Now, it sounds like you guys are pretty heavy users of Ansible, so hopefully this is useful. And there'll be something in there for you as well. So I'm going to cover off how to write, how to construct your repositories, that kind of thing, how to actually execute, some tips there, and then how you might use it in the real world. So first of all, me, very quickly, don't worry. From the UK, as Crane helpfully pointed out, still waiting to Brexit, get that one out there. Been in configuration management and automation for a long time now, so Ansible fits into that quite nicely. Red Hat, just over 5 years. I work in what we call the emerging technology team covering Europe, so get to play with all the new stuff like Ansible. And most recently Kubernetes as well, and of course operators. All good stuff. Okay, so first of all, how to use Ansible. So this is just some hints and tips on how you might lay out your repositories, how you might construct your playbooks, that kind of thing. So first of all, Ansible's clearly not a programming language. It's just YAML, of course. But you do definitely want to treat it as code. So, that's very important from day one, treat it as code and version control. And next thing is to iterate. Don't be afraid to just get started with some basic playbooks and a basic inventory. Just get cracking. As you play with it more, you'll learn new stuff. You can iterate and you can refactor and change things as you go. So just don't worry about getting started and changing it later. The simplicity of Ansible lends itself to that. Next thing to concern yourself with is style. So there's lots of choice, lots of things you can do within Ansible. Just naming conventions, what variables to use, whether to use what kind of white space, tabs or spaces. So there's loads of things you can do. What we found though is that it makes sense to decide on a style early on and get everyone in your team to agree with that and sort of set that in stone and use that moving forward. We found that really accelerates the learning process, so it's a really good thing to do. At the bottom there's an example, and it is just that, so it's a good place to start. OpenShift Ansible style guide. So the next step really is to get organized. So we talked about style guide. Within that is the structure you might use. This is just a very high level example again. So you might have inventories in a folder, you might have roles as well. One thing that's not mentioned on there is I like to have a plays folder as well, just keep my playbooks in there. It keeps the root nice and tidy. So for version control, start using something like Git. It's fairly popular and it's free, of course, it's always good. You could get in there, start with the basics, just get it in Git, iterate, start with a single repository. As your automation grows, you want to consider splitting it out. So typical examples are maybe a project-based repo or an application-based, whatever it might be. The key is always simplicity with Ansible, so keep things simple. Roles always should be in their own repo, just as a side note. Okay, so drilling down a bit into what we've got so far, starting with the inventory file. So when you first start, you'll have one or two nodes in there, an IP address or two, and of course that grows. Make your life easy. Put a host name in there. It doesn't need to be in DNS, but just something friendly to help you know what you're doing. When you're running plays, the output, and it's an IP address is shown in the output, it just makes things a little more abstracted and difficult. If you've got a nice friendly host name in there, use it. Why not? Next thing to consider is groups. They're pretty powerful. You can move away from notifying single nodes and start doing groups. So you can, you get your automation out there really quickly, so they're pretty useful. You want to think about how you can slice and dice your environment. So these are just typical examples. It might be a type of server or a location or dev test, something like that. It also makes your playbooks simpler. So if you think about having conditions and things within your playbook to only run against certain types of server, if you've moved that logic back into your group, then you don't need to have a complicated routine in your playbook. So again, simplification. So dynamic sources is the next thing to look at. So very quickly, if you start using Ansible and Ango, your inventory file will grow. You don't want to have to manually manage that. So you look at dynamic inventories. So you're looking at a single source of truth, which might be something like Amazon, vCenter, something like that. So there's plenty of examples that you can use, just a Perl script, and you can load the inventory directly and automatically from that source. You can also combine inventories, and of course all of that reduces human error and just makes life easier. So moving on to variables, just a word, yeah? So again, keep things simple. If you think about the whole point of Ansible is making your life easier, coming back, moving away from a playbook and coming back in a few months' time and being able to read it and understand what you're doing. So use sensible variable names, something that makes sense and you can easily determine what that was for. And again, with debugging as well, want to know easily what that variable was doing. Another consideration is for roles. So to try and avoid collisions with variables, put a suffix of the actual, also prefix the variable with the role name, so that assists there. The next consideration with variables is the location. So there's, at last count, I think about 16 or 17 different places you can set variables. So it's quite, it's a long list, quite bewildering and confusing. So if you think back to the style guide, decide on 2 or 3 places that make sense for your organization and stick to that. Make that your standard. So it just makes, again, life easier. You know where to go, the expected location for variables. So back to debugging, and after the fact, it makes your life easier again. One point with repetitive tasks, so if you've got a playbook with a number of repetitive tasks in there, it makes sense to maybe variabilize certain attributes. So look for things like that where you can, again, simplify the automation, abstract a variable and store that. Okay, so readability of the playbooks. So Ansible at its core is a YAML parser. So it accepts key pair values, which is fine. Indeed, when you run a basic, what am I thinking of? A core command just with Ansible, it'll expect you to have key pairs on the command line, which is fine and totally valid. But within a YAML file, it doesn't read well, as you can see in this example. It goes off the screen. So you want to make it more readable, more user-friendly. Again, at a later date, you want to come back and be able to read this easily and understand what was going on. So you need to do something like this. So you use the standard Ansible, standard YAML syntax within the playbook. It reads top to bottom. It's nice and simple to understand. You can see the key pairs. And also, if you're using something like Vim, it'll actually highlight the key pair and also show you if you've got any syntax errors. So again, making your life easier, the theme. So moving on to task names. So it's very easy not to bother with task names. It's one less line of YAML, which is obviously good. But in this example here, you can see the output from the play is not confusing, but a little sort of abstracted. So you're seeing a play run against a particular server, but you don't know what that play was actually doing. So if we look at this next example, we've added a name label. And now we can instantly see from the play output that it makes a lot more sense. So it's much easier to understand. So spend some time adding name, get into the habit of adding a name label for each of your tasks. It also has the added benefit of documenting your playbook. And not having to do documentation is always a bonus as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so blocks is another useful tool. They allow you to organize tasks logically within your playbook. It also allows you to build in rollback capability. So if there's something specific you want to do as part of your play and then roll back, or maybe just dump some information, using a block is a nice thing to do. So again, get into the habit of using those if you can. Okay, so moving on to the execution part. Now, what tools are there to help you? Launching's fine, but what happens when it goes wrong? So on the command line, there's a number of switches that are useful. You've got the verbose V's for different levels, so extra logging for you when the output. The step option allows you to step through each play, fairly self-explanatory. Check is a bit like a dry run. You need to be careful though, because not actually doing the plays may produce some sort of erroneous results further down, but it's still quite useful. The diff option allows you to work out if you've got within your playbook templates and file changes using Ginger 2. It allows you to highlight any differences that might be applied. And then finally, start at task. So again, you can start where at a given point within the playbook. Just some additional options. List tasks, so list the tasks that would actually be invoked as part of that playbook. That's normally used in conjunction with a tags filter. List the available tags in the playbook as well. List host is quite useful, so you can use it for two things. First of all, to validate your inventory file to make sure the syntax is okay, but also to produce a list of the hosts you're going to notify with your automation. So just to double check that it's as expected. And then finally, the syntax check. So check, do a YAML validation of your playbook just to make sure you've got no typos. One small little nice to know, you can actually run a play against a host without querying the inventory, and you do so like that, so the comma's the important bit there. It's a small nice to know, but I personally never use it. Okay, so using the right tools or specifically modules for the job is important. So in Ansible, I think the last count was nearly 700 different modules. So there's a lot of choice. And you need to work out ideally which one to use. So this is just an example. So the what we do, we advise basically to steer clear of. There's 3 modules which people use quite a lot and should really try to avoid at all costs. So we've got command, shell, and raw. So they're great for just running raw commands, for debugging and so forth, but you will cause you problems in the long run. So if we take this first example here, we're using, on the left, we're using command to run user add, and that's fine, it'll do the job. You run it again, it'll fail. We actually have a user module to do just that. So rather than running the command directly, we're specifying the user, and they're just saying state present. So we can run that as many times as we like. It'll make the change on the first occasion, and afterwards it won't, it'll just know it's there and continue. It'll make no changes. But more importantly, it won't error. So, like I say, it's nearly 700, plenty of choice. If you find a command that's definitely not in a module, and you're using command a lot, then maybe it's a good opportunity to look into writing a module yourself. There's an Ansible-docs command which allows you to, it's basically like a man page for all the docs. So you can do Ansible doc -l and then grep out for whatever keyword you want to help you find a necessary module. Okay, so next tip is about validating what you've done has actually worked. So in this example, you start a service and it returns 0, I'm okay. That's fine, but maybe you want to take a more belt and braces approach and make sure it's definitely done what you wanted. So in this example, you're just using the URI module just to query the web page and check for a certain specific words, basically, from the web page. And you can, in this case, retry 10 times, and then we know you're good to go. So good practice to get into. Obviously, you've got to weigh it up against the complexity. So if it's a simple playbook, you need to keep things simple, but something more elaborate is worth doing something like this. Just help in the long run. Already mentioned Ginger 2. So Ginger 2 is great, really powerful. If you've got a managed file, we recommend using the Ansible managed keyword just to stick a comment in the file to say this is managed by Ansible. Just makes life easier again. As a side note, Ginger 2 does lots of things. You can do all sorts of elaborate routines in a text file. So I would advise to keep things simple. Again, if you're thinking about debugging, looking at things 6 months down the line, keep things simple so you know what you're doing. Don't create some really convoluted process to make some crazy template. Just think about doing it in a different fashion. Okay, so roles and Galaxy. So a role is just an encapsulation of operational functions. Okay, it should be in its own Git repo, as we mentioned already. Any dependencies store in the requirements YAML, and another key point is limit dependencies. So again, simplicity. Okay. So collections in Galaxies. So it's another great resource. I would be careful though in what you use. It's an unknown quantity. Always check what you're downloading. There's no moderation, unlike the operator's hub. So just be careful what you're using. Stick to known authors. If it's something you're happy to use, obviously validate and make sure it fits your requirements. But just be careful. So what access rights do we need? So standard Linux, don't use root. Have a specific user for Ansible and allow it to sudo. So use the become user keyword to be able to elevate permissions and run it that way. That means, apart from anything, you can audit more efficiently and track what you've actually done. So moving on to debugging. So there's various places to look at. On the client side, so Ansible's agentless. So there's not a great deal to look on the client. What you can do is look at var log messages, and that's the kind of output you'd receive, so you can see whether, sort of some basic things, what's happening in there. In addition to that, what you can do, again, because it's agentless, the way it works is it takes the automation you've created, bundles it up, copies it over, extracts it, runs it, and then deletes it. So you can bypass that behavior with that Ansible keep remote files option. That'll leave the code in place. You can then run it with the second command. So useful to know for debugging. On the playbook side, we've got the debug module. So as with using name for all your tasks, use debug as well. It's useful. The verbosity option is also quite useful. If you think about when you're developing, you might want extra detail in your logging, so it'd be useful to have the verbosity with a higher number. And then when whatever playbook it is goes into production, then a standard user doing debug won't necessarily see all the information, just to limit the output. Okay, so all of that's good, but your managed environment's growing all the time, and it's really an enterprise scenario, and you've got a bit of an overhead managing your inventory and all the other bits and pieces. So in real life, fairly obvious, you need to use Tower. So Tower's been built and designed with Ansible Core in mind. It extends the limits of Tower to include enterprise requirements. So you've got self-service, API, scalability, reporting, that kind of thing. So first of all, roles. Now, it supports roles insofar as when in the Tower we have a project, which is basically a repo. So you add the project repo. Tower will automatically look at the requirements YAML, import any roles in there, any dependent roles, import those for you. So you don't need to include the roles in your repo. You just make sure your requirements YAML is updated, and it'll deal with it on the fly. Another useful tip is to fix the version. So if you've got specific requirements within your playbook to use a certain version of a role, then put that in there, so to avoid any problems later on. It also helps with auditing as well. So who are we talking to? So inventory side of things, pretty similar to Core. You've got the same kind of plugin architecture where you can add vCenter, OpenStack, whatever it might be, as a single source of truth. You can combine them just like you can with Core. One added bonus is the smart inventory concept. So based on the gathered facts, you can have a host filter and create this sort of virtual inventory across all of your inventories. So that's a nice feature. So moving on to jobs. Everything's a job really in Tower, but specifically with playbooks. Playbooks as a service are what a job template is in Tower. So you create a job template based on a repository and a playbook in a repository, and that allows users to easily consume playbooks optionally with extra vars and that kind of thing. As with roles and playbooks, keep things simple and focused. Don't overcomplicate things. Labels are useful. So label it with a production, location, a type of application, whatever it might be, but they're useful for grouping and filtering later on. Notification as well is quite useful, but we'll cover that shortly, but include notification wherever you can. So a single playbook is great, but what about more complex workflows? So fortunately, we've got workflows now in Tower, and they've been there for a couple of releases now. 3.1, I think, was when they were introduced. From a user perspective, the simplicity is still there. They're still requesting a single service, but behind that, you can have one or more playbooks. In addition, you can do synchronizations of inventory and projects as well. The useful ability to include rollback, so react to problems and then run another playbook, so you can have that rollback capability, or perhaps do some notification or hook into another system. Okay, so for job templates, you optionally have a dialogue or a survey. So again, keep things simple. Now, you don't have to have a survey, but it may be that you want to ask questions or present questions to the user. So as before, keep it simple, limit the number of questions, validate what you put in there, make sure the variables are logical, make sense. If you've got empty fields that are more often than not empty, then consider whether or not you actually need those. So tenancy is one of the capabilities that Tower provides as well, so make use of it. Within Tower, an organization is effectively a tenant, so within that you have teams and other subordinate resources like projects and credentials and so forth. So make use of that architecture, but also limit visibility. So don't give users the most basic access, and give them more if needs be, but use it. The ultimate, of course, the credentials are in there as well, so the fact that credentials are stored in Tower means you don't need to expose those to users. At no point do they need the keys or anything else. So Tower credentials, similar to the Ansible core credentials. You want a dedicated user with all the required, sudo and all the other we mentioned earlier. Keys and passwords can be really complex too, because they're never exposed to the user. You can make them as complex as you like. But also, Tower will also serve as a vault, should you need it, for all those keys. So notification, it integrates. So Tower integrates with all the usual suspects. So email being the fairly standard one, but Slack, IRC, webhooks. You make use of it. They're by default. You get notification, job status, and that sort of thing, but you can easily extend that to include sending messages to a ticketing system or some kind of monitoring system. So, make use of that functionality. Logging. So central logging is required. In a larger environment, you're going to have several Tower servers, so you need to centralize that logging. So like most places, you can use the Splunk and so forth. So as far as messages you want to concern, it's the job status, grab those, and then Tower status and health, that kind of thing. Finally, scalability. So you can configure and deploy Tower in an HA environment. It's a Postgres database under the covers. It's fully documented on how to do it. In theory, it's fairly straightforward. I have to admit, I've not done it myself, but the documentation is pretty good. But yeah, you can install Tower in a full HA environment or configuration. And that's it. Hopefully there was something useful in there for you.
Thank you. Well, we have a couple of questions from the audience. Okay, let's take a look. What has gone viral? Okay, so let's put the first one on. What's the recommended approach to share pieces of my scenario across several playbooks, even among geographically? 6 likes. So that's the top question. Do you have answer to that?
I would say a role. If you've got a code that you need to reuse across various playbooks, that should be in a role, if I understand the question correctly.
This is a good question as well. Should I? Or is it written right? So someone who did it Maybe you could clarify a bit. I didn't write the question, so it's not my thing. Okay, could you please? Okay, sure. That's for him.
So different repositories, basically. Your playbooks are in disparate repositories, and you need to use those as part of a single workflow. Is that what you mean? So in that scenario, I would say you have a job template per repository, and that would make a workflow. So if you think a template is effectively hard-coded to a repository or a project with a playbook, so a specific playbook in that repository, and then you would have them together in a single workflow, and that could go off and run each playbook, if I understand.
Okay. Hope it was an at least decent answer to your question. Okay. Thank you. There's another one. Using group vars versus including vars files based on an environment variable. An interesting one as well. Should it be clarified?
I think so.
Okay.
Using group vars.
Who wrote this? Can you please help us out with the question? We want to understand it a bit better. Yeah, there we go.
All right.
So we had a discussion during lunch. Some of us are like just using the group variables directory structure to like provision our playbooks with variables based on like what group the hosts are in.
Yep.
Others like just including variables based on variables, for example, an environmental variable that you pass during the playbook run. So which do you think is a better approach, or does it matter?
Well, if you've got it in a group vars file, you're effectively hard coding, aren't you? If you want a variable, and there's no reason why you couldn't use it as an environment variable and override. It makes perfect sense. It really depends whether you actually need to if it's having it hard coded in your repo is good or bad for your use case. So it's in a group vars file.
Yeah, no, I mean you could set up the directory structure for including variables based on your group, or you could just like create an inventories that like an inventories directory then inside with an environment, like directories for each environment and with the variable files in there, and just include whichever you need based on an environment or variable as the execution.
I do. It sounds like you should probably variabilize and pass it in as you have. I mean, is there some kind of standard logic naming, for example, so you can work out what the environment is programmatically rather than having it within a different, if you've got a set of files with different values, can you not programmatically generate the value and just pass it in as an override? It sounds like having, you've got a lot of files there to manage for a start. Yeah. So I would say maybe look at trying to work out how to generate that variable base. I mean, there might be a naming convention, for example, for the environments, some way of programmatically working out what the environment would be, and then you don't need to worry about managing the variable itself. As usual, there's many ways of doing these things.
Okay, thank you. Are you up for one more?
Sure.
Okay, last one. Okay.
Only if I know the answer.
How deploy and manage Linux services by using Ansible?
How to deploy a managed Linux service.
If it's too tough, we can have a little coffee break and conversation down in the lobby.
Well, I mean, it depends on the underlying, what provider are you using to spin up the Linux VM. So you deploy a VM on VMware, whatever it might be, and then you want to configure that as a post-deployment routine.
Mm-hmm. Is it good?
So you'd leverage, I don't know, OpenStack, whatever it is, and then customize it accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's very much based on the underlying provider. So
Okay.
you could have a fat image, you could use Pixie, you could do all sorts of things, and then just do run a playbook post-install.
So it's actually a topic we could put on open space. There's a lot of things we could actually discuss, and there are a couple of more questions actually that audience wanted to ask, and I think we should leave this for a coffee break. So are you up for a chat?
Sure.
Down there? Yeah? Okay,
Definitely up for a
anyone who
coffee.
wants to ask any questions, please come down to Nick. Please make some noise for Nick Catling. Thank you.